You know, even 2 decades after his death, there's one name that still just electrifies the Middle East, sparking both intense admiration and, well, total revulsion. Saddam Hussein. This was an orphan boy who climbed his way up from absolutely nothing to become one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, controversial leaders of the 20th century. His legacy is this tangled web of contradictions, a story of a modern nation built on a foundation of fear and of national pride that was paid for with an ocean of blood.
I mean, just stop and think about that journey for a second. From a tiny village, fatherless, growing up in brutal poverty, all the way to the presidential palace in Baghdad, where he's commanding one of the biggest armies in the entire region. It's a rise to power that's so extreme it almost feels like something out of a myth.
And that right there, that's the central paradox, isn't it? That's what we're going to dig into today. How can one man be seen as this national hero who literally built his country and at the exact same time be a ruthless dictator who terrorized his own people? To get that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to see what forged the man who would one day rule a nation.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. Section 1, Orphan to Strongman. You know, a leader's political style is almost always shaped by their youth. And for Saddam, his youth was this brutal, unforgiving fire that taught him one single crucial lesson. The only thing that can keep you safe is power.
His life basically began in trauma. His father was gone before he was even born. His mother, grieving, tried to end her own life while she was pregnant with him. Can you imagine? As a kid without a dad, he was bullied relentlessly. So what did he do? He started carrying a steel rod. He learned really young that violence was a pretty effective way to protect himself. And then, at just 10 years old, he runs away from an abusive stepfather. That single act of survival would end up changing the course of his life and the history of Iraq forever.
He eventually found a safe place with his uncle, who gave him more than just a home. He gave him a new identity, and really, a new family. This small, fiercely nationalist group called the Ba'ath Party. It was right here that this angry, fearless kid found a political purpose for all that ambition and his capacity for violence.
And once he was in, his rise was just explosive and violent. The party saw his ruthless streak right away. When he was just 22, they picked him for a mission: assassinate the prime minister. Now, the attempt actually failed, but his pure gutsiness got him noticed by some pretty big international players, including the CIA, who kind of filed his name away as a guy to watch. He had to flee to Egypt, but a decade later, the Ba'ath Party takes over, and he comes back to become the second most powerful man in the entire country.
Okay, Section 2, the Godfather of Baghdad. So now he's in power, and he immediately starts this kind of dual strategy. On one hand, you have Saddam the visionary modernizer. But on the other, you have this paranoid patriarch who demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty.
So the very first thing he does is seize Iraq's most precious asset, its oil. He nationalizes it, taking it right out of British control. And this was a huge deal across the Middle East. His timing? Perfect. The 1973 oil crisis hits, prices go through the roof, and Saddam takes all that money and pours it into transforming Iraq. We're talking free schools, free hospitals, electricity in villages that had never had it. He made the Iraqi currency, the dinar, so strong it was worth $3. For a lot of Iraqis, he wasn't just a politician, he was building their nation. He was a hero.
But while he's building this nation, he's also building a very specific persona of absolute power. And you're not going to believe where he found his inspiration. It wasn't some political philosopher or a famous general. Nope, it was a Hollywood movie about a mafia family.
I'm serious. He became obsessed with The Godfather. He saw Don Corleone as a blueprint for how a leader should act. He copied everything: the tailored suits, the hats, and of course the cigar, held in that same calm, calculating, menacing way. This was a deliberate performance, a way to project this image of an untouchable father figure who held everyone's fate in his hands.
And he wasn't just playing dress-up, he put that persona into terrifying practice. Just 6 days after he officially became president in 1979, he called a meeting of the entire Ba'ath Party leadership. And what happened next would be burned into the memory of everyone in that room and the entire nation.
He gets up on stage, calmly lights a cigar, and announces that a conspiracy against him has just been uncovered. And then he starts to slowly, deliberately read a list of names. And as each name was called, that person was labeled a traitor and dragged out of the hall. 68 members in total were taken away. Many of them were executed later. The message was brutally crystal clear. Your loyalty to Saddam must be absolute. The price for anything less is death.
All right, so now we get to Section 3, Warlords of the Middle East. With his power totally locked down at home, Saddam starts looking outward. He really saw himself as the leader of the entire Arab world. But his big gambles on the world stage would turn out to be completely disastrous.
His first major gamble was invading Iran in 1980. Now you have to understand, this wasn't just about land, it was ideological. Saddam, a Sunni leader of a country with the Shia majority, was terrified of Ayatollah Khomeini's Shia revolution next door. He was afraid it would spread. He thought it'd be a quick victory, but instead, it turned into this brutal 8-year-long war. It ended in a total stalemate, with over 1 million people dead, and Iraq completely drowning in debt to its Arab neighbors.
So now he's crippled by debt, and he's furious when countries like Kuwait start asking for their money back. To make it worse, Kuwait ramped up its oil production, which drove down global prices and hurt Iraq's economy even more. Saddam took it as a deep personal insult. In his mind, it was like, this little country, Kuwait, how dare it challenge me, Saddam Hussein?
And so, in 1990, he makes the fatal miscalculation of his career. He invades and annexes Kuwait, thinking the world would just let him do it. For a hot second, he was the undisputed strong man of the Arab world, controlling a massive chunk of its oil. But that one move turned his old friends, including the US and Saudi Arabia, into his most powerful enemies. So this brings us to Section 4, the pious survivor. After being defeated in the Gulf War and basically cut off from the world by sanctions, Saddam was in real trouble. So, in this kind of masterful act of political survival, he does something incredible. He completely reinvents himself. I mean, just look at this. It is a complete 180. The secular, alcohol-drinking leader, gone. And in his place, you have this pious, devout Muslim. He starts making Quran study mandatory in schools, he bans alcohol, and he even adds Allahu Akbar, God is great, to the Iraqi flag. This was all a very calculated political move. By wrapping himself in religion, he tapped into this growing anti-Western feeling, reframing his fight as a holy war against so-called crusaders. And that message was incredibly powerful in the region.
But even as he's presenting this new pious image to the world, the most damaging blow, well, it came from inside his own family. 2 of his top generals, who also happened to be his sons-in-law, they defected to Jordan. And they stood in front of the world's cameras and gave his enemies the one thing they desperately needed, a pretext. They claimed that Saddam had a secret program to build weapons of mass destruction.
And that was all the excuse his enemies needed. This brings us to our final act, the dictator's downfall. After 9/11, the United States, now armed with this story about WMDs, set its sights squarely on Baghdad. And the end came so quickly. The U.S. invasion in March 2003 smashed his government in just a few weeks. A few months later, his sons, Uday and Qusay, were killed in a shootout. And then, in December, the man who lived in these massive, opulent palaces was found by U.S. soldiers, all disheveled and bearded, hiding in a little hole in the ground. After a televised trial that the whole world watched, he was executed in December 2006. But here's the thing. Even at the very end, he refused to be broken. His first words when they captured him, "I am Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq." Throughout his trial, he taunted the judges. He refused to even recognize their authority. He presented himself not as a criminal, but as the legitimate leader of Iraq. Right up until the very end, he played the part he had created for himself. So, that's it. Section 6, a contradictory legacy. A tyrant had been removed from power, but the story doesn't end there, not by a long shot, because the power vacuum he left behind, it unleashed forces that were even more destructive than his own rule.
Saddam's brutal rule was replaced by years of bloody civil war and the rise of terrifying insurgencies. See, the thing is, his whole strategy was to brutally suppress Iraq's different ethnic and religious groups. He kept a lid on all these deep tensions. The second that lid was gone, the whole thing just erupted into a firestorm. And that brings us to the central, unresolved question of his legacy. Yes, the tyrant was removed, but was the chaos that came next a worthwhile price to pay? That's a question that Iraq, and frankly, the world, is still struggling to answer.